time, money, dreaming, and enlightenment. For me, those are all tied together in a very interesting way. I have talked about the heart up to this time as something that's used to set up the twilight awareness, that space between, which is a discrete sense of being that lies somewhere between waking and sleeping, both as you're going to bed at night and as you're waking up in the morning. But in truth, you can move into the heart at any time during your waking day, and that turns out to be tremendously beneficial. And in order to do that, is simply to remember to breathe into the heart center. Feel the difference. That can be a sense of warmth. It might be a glowing. It might be light. It might be peace. It might be stillness. It could be anything, whatever that is for you, that's your marker. All you have to do is to do that as you're moving through your day. And what you will find is that the heart itself is an organ of perception. And when you are in that heart, you perceive the world differently than you do from your other five senses. So what can happen then is in that perception, the world itself becomes transformed. You can walk into any situation, if you're centered in your heart, if you can remember to do that, it's not easy to do, not easy to remember sometimes, but you can diffuse potentially volatile situations. You can you can move into stillness, which is really wonderful. Because what you're doing is moving from here down to the heart center, is you're moving into this sense of peace, primarily because now you have moved away from the narrative self. Remember, the narrative self is always telling stories. Most of the times, those stories are rooted in fear of one thing or another. So when you move into the heart, you've suddenly moved away from fear into something that's much more expansive, much more relational. Call it love, call it whatever you want to call it. The words are not significant. It's the feeling and the sensation that's really important. So when you're out for a walk, it's a great time to practice moving into this space and just see what the world looks like from the perceptive perspective of the heart. Very, very different altogether. And that stillness especially can become something so wonderful and so unique, because so much of our lives are tied up in this anxiety and striving and worrying and trying to prove ourselves to the world. And all of that begins to drop away, and you move into stillness. And in that stillness, then you're open to the mystery and the wonder and the surprise of the world. And you begin to realize that the world is communicating with us all the time. And we are not separate from the world, but we are part of this energy flow, this mix, this mysterious and wonderful sense of what it means to be alive. Very, very different from the closed off, isolated, fearful, rejecting brain. The brain always wants to slice and dice and categorize. It sees everything in isolation. When we're learning to speak from the earliest of age, the things we learn first are nouns, things. We name those things. We think of them as things that are in isolation from the context in which they exist, when in fact they are not isolated in any way, shape, or form. Everything is interrelated. Everything is interdependent. When you move to the heart, you can begin to sense some of that, and it drops, so that fear that is driven by that sense of isolation begins to die away. So I would urge you to practice that and just see what happens. Notice the markers again. You can tell when you're in that heart space and when you're not. We're not going to worry about whether you are actually inside of it. In this case, all we're going to do is just do that first step of breathing into the heart and allowing then the world to be transformed, to perceive the world from that perspective. Remember, we're talking about time, money, dreaming, and enlightenment that are all related to each other. When you are operating from the heart, then because you're not locked in this place of fear, you become open to lots of other types of opportunities that can come your way. things you never would have considered before, because you just couldn't see them before, because you're so wrapped up in this sense of fear. But when you move to the heart, then you find that resources can start to come to you, and that can be both monetary. It can be resources for projects you're working on. It can be creativity. It can be inspiration. All of those are interrelated once we move into the heart. It's very, very significant and very, very important to follow that through. Ordinarily, we think of time as being that which, just imagine if you are that you're standing in a stream and you're looking forward toward the future. Future's out there, you can't really see it, but then the water flows around your body, and your body creates little whirlpools and eddies on the back side of it, and that's what we call its experience. And those eddies can loop back around, and that's what we call memory. So in essence, everything that's behind us is part of that history that we have, and that's sort of what we know, because we've experienced it. So we haven't experienced the future yet, but we have experienced the past because it's moved past us in the now. When you think about it, all of our world is based very, very much on this idea of taking what has been passed and gone by us, and then sort of examining that with our minds, and then projecting that into the future as our way of dealing with the future. If you look at all of our law is based on precedent. In other words, we look to the past in order to examine cases that have already taken place, and then we apply that to the case that's in the future. If you look at myth, that's another way that countless generations have dealt with the future. They've looked at myths of the past to tell them how to move and navigate in the future. We look at history as another example of that. Those who do not know history are condemned to repeat it. The elders have long been revered in many, many cultures of the past because, why? They had the experience that could tell the community how to move forward into the future. But the problem that we face right now is that our world is changing so rapidly that the lessons of the past no longer apply as we move into the future. The lessons of the past could in no way anticipate the world that we're moving into. Religion is another example of looking to the past. Old and ancient texts are looking to the past in order to prepare us for a future. But when the future changes so rapidly, we're in real trouble. It worked in the past because culture evolved so slowly that from one generation to the next there was very little change. But now with technology, we've entered into a completely different world. And for most of us, we feel completely at a loss of how to deal with that future. I read this book by Robert Sardello. It's called Love in the Soul. Robert Sardello raises the possibility that there is a second stream of time flowing in the opposite direction. There is a time stream that flows from the past into the future. So that now, as it's flowing and moving through our bodies, it's creating eddies of experience that actually exist in the future. When I was at the Monroe Institute, I worked with Skip Atwater. When I was executive director, he was the president. We had just a wonderful relationship. And Skip had created the remote viewing program for the U.S. Army. He was one of the people that was instrumental in it. And in remote viewing, what you're doing is you're gathering information independent of time and space. You don't have to be there physically to get the information. Neither are you confined by time, because you can go both backwards and forwards in time to gather this information. It's a very strict protocol that they have arrived at. It's called remote viewing. In different cultures, it would have been called different things. It might have been the providence of the oracle or the seer who was able to do this. But the important thing here is that information was arrived at in time and space had no bearing on how that information was achieved. Skip used to tell me, information travels both backwards and forwards in time. And for him, that was not a metaphor, it was reality. I think he's right. That's one certainly way of looking at it. And when we've got this other time stream that's going in the opposite direction, now our experience, the eddies of our experience as this stream moves through us, are in the future. Which means that our future self, which is in existence right now, is able to communicate with our present self and help us to navigate that which seems so beyond our sense of capability of dealing with it. It's a very profound perspective on life. I told the story of when I was going through seminary. One of the last things, it's a very involved process. It took like 3 years to do, and graduate school, and just so many hoops to jump through. One of the last hoops was that I had to appear before the Presbyterian. The Presbyterian was a group of a bunch of churches in one area that would have a meeting about once a quarter. Part of what happened at that meeting was the examination of candidates for the ministry. Now, at that time in my life, I was absolutely terrified of speaking in front of groups. It was so hard for me. And to think that I would get up in front of a group of 300 people from churches and people that I didn't even know, and they could examine me on anything that they wanted to that was related to my statement of faith. So the statement of faith was something I read to the group, and they could ask me anything about that. I had no way to prepare for it. So the day before I was going over my statement of faith, and something clicked in my head, and I said, I bet if they ask me anything, it will be about this particular thing. So I looked it up in there's this massive handbook that is part of the Presbyterian tradition. It's called the Book of Order. Got all kinds of stuff to try to remember. And so the day came for me to speak in front of this group. I read my statement of faith. I mean, I was just terrified. And would you believe it? The first person that got up came over to the microphone, time stopped, and his lips started moving, and out of his mouth came the very question that I had been alerted to the day before. So I said to him, well, the intent of that statement comes from page 22 of the Book of Order. And everybody goes, whoa! The kid even knows the page! Isn't that amazing? And it's like pandemonium broke out, Well, you know what? I wouldn't have known the page number for any other question that they could have asked me, but I knew the page number for that one. Why? Because my future self knew what was coming and was able to communicate with me in the present. So imagine what we're talking about here. Now, we're talking about a very different way of going through life. Now, you might say, well, that's just, I don't know. I don't buy that. Time moving in the opposite direction. Well, prove it. Well, there are signs that we actually do have communication with the future. We might know them as intuition. We might know, as the example I gave, as information coming to us that couldn't come from any other way. It might be, precognition, deja vu, certain knowing. I was talking to somebody recently, and she said, I've always known that, blah, blah, blah. Well, how do you always know that? Because your future is communicating. So when this time stream flowing in the opposite direction, and because the experience now is in the future, we know these things because we've already experienced them at some level. I think that these two time streams intersect at the heart. And that's why it's so important to move into the heart. Now we're in a position where, as we're moving through our day, we're not only experiencing the world around us in a new way, in a more relational way, we are actually also forming a relationship with the future. We are changing so much that the old ways of looking at the past in order to project the future, seeing trends that we think are going to lead us into the future, is no longer going to work. Because those trends are being disrupted. And look all around you, you can see our institutions starting to break down. Whether that's religion, or whether that's law, or whether that's politics, or take your pick. Even his attack on science, etc. Somehow we need to form a different relationship with the future, and I think we can do that through the heart. As you practice moving into the heart, also try to feel what it might be like to imagine those two time streams moving in opposite directions through the heart. Experiment with that. See what that's like. See how that feels to you and how that changes things. Again, if you're doing this, this is another way of moderating the fear of the future. And it can really change things. We know from this perspective because we've already lived it. We've already experienced it. PMH Atwater has a book called Future Memory. And she tells the experience of going into this trance state unintentionally. She was actually at work when she was given this vision of what was going to happen to her over the next 8 months in great detail. And as if to reinforce it, no sooner did she come out of it, she went back into it again, and it was given to her in even greater detail. So from her perspective, what we're actually trying to do here is to remember the future, to remember what we've already lived, and to communicate with that future self. So, which is a great thing to do. If you have a question about the future, is just to throw it out there and to see what you get back. Get out of your mind and move into your heart, and just to see what can happen. All right, so the heart is how we access the future. And dreams can work in that way too. You remember we're talking about time, money, dreams, and enlightenment. And I should also say that we haven't talked a lot about enlightenment, but I want to point out to you that the essence of enlightenment is when this narrative self, this narrative mind, this constant monologue that happens up here, that's always judging, slicing and dividing and judging and fearful and obsessed with survival at all costs, when that starts to fall away as we move into the heart, when we can achieve that stillness, the world starts to open up. And that stillness can be part of the essence of what it means to be enlightened. If you never experienced that before, I strongly urge you to look at that from the perspective of the heart to see what happens.